Hi, and welcome back to the National Cathedrals Conference podcast 2022. And it's day 3. Now, I normally start off with how I've been feeling today. For once, I'm actually going to ask Jordan, how are you feeling today?
Well, got a good sleep in, so a lot better today. Today's been a lot more chill. We haven't had as much to do today, so we've been fine today, I think.
I mean, we're still working hard. Don't you worry, listeners. It's not been as rushy.
Hectic. It's not been hectic.
I think hectic is the best way to describe it. A lot more peaceful, a lot more time to prepare for our evening podcast session, as we like to do. Today's focus has been on racial justice, and we've had opening speech by Roger Governand. It was titled Racial Justice Introduction, and it was such a great and interesting speech, and he spoke so wonderfully. The other great speeches we had were reparations, restorations and resolutions, re-envisioning cathedrals as part of a place for racial reconciliation, what if racism never ends, creating a future spacious in cathedrals, and making waves, all ruling waves. And it was so special to have Robert Beckford, who was getting so passionate in his speech that I had to be given a mic so we could keep walking around, as Jordan will say. He was a very passionate speaker, wasn't he? You were actually in the room.
Yeah, I was in the room. I think a lot of people that were there tended to miss some of the points that he made because we just couldn't hear him. Even if we went back and looked at the video, I don't think we would be able to tell what he was trying to say because he was so far away from the mic for probably a 2-minute period that he was basically just speaking to himself at that point.
But the ironic thing is also you could partly hear him because he was so loudly speaking and so passionate about what he was talking about. He didn't need the mic at points. Like, I could hear him from the communication room, which is quite far away from the nave where all these speeches are being held. As always, though, I have to segue to Jordan to summarise these great and magnificent speeches we have. So over to Jordan to summarise as usual.
Yeah, so I would say Roger, who basically introed and then brought on every speaker, you know, he did a very good job of introducing it. Two of the things that I would highlight from his talk at the beginning was the idea of this parish that he'd gone to. He asked them if they had leaders who were ethnic minorities, and the person that he spoke to says no, and Roger replied with basically just asking why, and the guy had said, well, we just never really thought to ask them. It wasn't a thing of ignorance. They weren't there trying to actively exclude them from conversation. It was just basically accidental. You know, I've called it blissful ignorance because it wasn't a thing of them trying to cause disharmony between ethnic minorities and white people. It was just entirely accidental, basically.
Oh, that's a really interesting point you made. I'm excited to dig deeper into that because I think that's a really important point that has come out of the conference. Microaggressions and blissful ignorance. What about the other speeches? Is there anything else you would quickly summarise to the viewers who didn't have the pleasure of being there?
Well, I would say, you know, Robert was so passionate and he spoke about African optimism and pessimism, which, you know, I would summarize in 2 key American figures, those being Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. I would say Martin Luther King embodies optimism with that idea very obviously iconic of I have a dream. He's looking forward into this is how we move forward as, you know, an integrated society. This is how we fully integrate black people into these spaces that we haven't been in.
Yeah, Robert said it best by saying they dream for a better world in order to achieve it. It's about knowing that it can be possible. It's a lot about we can hope for liberation. I think that is the best way to put it. Pessimism, though, it's more about most black people face a nightmare future given the permanence of racism, and the structures haven't been dealt with that have racism embedded with them. And Robert pointed out many things such as the housing, education, and the Anglican Church itself. They have inbuilt racism within it, so you can't hope for a better future because racism is purely embedded in it, and black people have to look for it within themselves to get a better future. Would you add anything to that, Jordan?
Well, I would say he highlights that neither of these theories, at least in his belief, is incorrect or correct. He says that, you know, optimism is important because it gives you hope for the future, whereas pessimism gives you that dose of realism that I think everyone needs in the world. But he does say that pessimism is more important because you can learn more from it, which, you know, I would say because it focuses more on those past mistakes, which can sometimes be a mistake, but it focuses on those past mistakes so that it can understand that, in their opinion, that the best way forward is for black people to be independent rather than to rely on the system that's already failed them multiple times.
Yeah.
And so, you know, those ideas of independence and community reliance are very important. And, you know, the idea of relying on your community is very central, not just among Afro-pessimisms, but also if you look at northern Labour towns here in the UK, places like Newcastle, you know, that was strong here because of coal towns that felt they had been left behind, especially after the coal mines had started to shut down and industrialisation had started to slow down. They weren't, you know, going to rely on a system that had already failed them multiple times. They would rather rely on the people around them, their community, to support them if they fell on hard times.
Yeah, no, I get it. I think that's a really interesting and thought-provoking way. There was a lot of talk around the making waves or ruling waves speech that we haven't mentioned yet. What was your take on that? Because that was quite a, I want to say, interesting speech to watch. He kept breaking into song, which was such an interesting way of presenting and engaging into people and referencing something that we all know so well is the song Rule Britannia, Britannia Rules the Waves, and linking that to something people know so well in Britain, linking it to something that I wouldn't say the majority of people know as quite well, as racism and racial injustice. So what was your take on that?
I think Azariah did a great job in that, particularly because I'm a fan of allegorical stories. I like biblical stories even as someone who isn't a Christian because it can be related to any situation. So I think him using not only biblical stories but stories like The Cat in the Hat and The Hunchback of Notre Dame made it relatable to more people. And also, if you're going to be honest, it helps children related to it because if you just say, you know, if I described The Hunchback of Notre Dame to a child and then says, do you sometimes feel like you need to get away from all of society? Is that how you felt at times? I think a lot of children would say yes. And I think Mark Russell from yesterday, who did a Future for All Children talk yesterday, I think he would agree with that. So I think how Azariah talked was brilliant. I think I particularly like the Quasimodo story just because it can embody anyone, both the, you know, the mental and physical problems that he goes through in that story, the physical problems of being actually disfigured and looked down upon, the mental problems that he struggles with, of that feeling of loneliness that once he's been isolated from the rest of France, how does he deal with that? And I think that is something that if you've been excluded from society or even a smaller community, that is something that you can deal with. And so I think him using Quasimodo to tell that story was a very smart idea.
Yeah, he talked in such a accessible and easy way to understand, and racism is such a broad and overwhelming topic. All these topics that we've talked about this week are so huge and overwhelming at times that to talk in such a simple and meaningful way, it helped understand more what he was coming from. It meant that you didn't feel like you had to decode what he was saying, and I would say that for all speakers today, they've spoken so elegantly and so meaningfully and so simply, and I think that's sometimes the best way to speak. You're not having to go, oh God, what does this person mean? And luckily Jordan and I are both training historians, so we sort of know how to read in between the lines, because if you've ever read any contextual history, it's quite hard to decode, isn't it, Jordan?
Yeah, it's quite hard, which makes it, you know, useful here. But one thing that I did want to go into that I forgot to mention about Robert's speech is these ideas of social death and theology that he goes into. So he says that social death is an idea where once black people have already been dealing with things on an isolated level, let's say you just experienced police brutality, but you don't experience the other flaws in the system that may exploit you or make you feel left out. That incident on its own, or that problem on its own, that's bad enough. But then once you start to experience more and more flaws in the system, you begin to experience social death, where you feel like you just have no place in society, and ultimately, you know, what's the point in doing anything when none of it has any effect. And so I think his point was black people can feel like that in Western societies because they've been so conditioned to not feel like they belong that they've just been left out. But I think it's also important, and I think Robert would agree with this, that they wake up in a certain way. And to link it to Azariah's speech, he was saying, when you wake up, your cleaners, your school children, those that you've excluded, the homeless, the poor, when you wake them up, you wake up Jesus, you wake up God's vision for the world, and you help achieve God's mission by helping those people.
Yeah, I think it's this really interesting point you've just made about social death and how black people can feel disconnected and like they don't have place in society. And I think they particularly face that because of colonial pasts, and because they could have been born in this country, could have had multiple generations in this country, but actually they might not know their roots because of Britain's past of colonialism and wiping out cultures, but Britain didn't seem as cultured and educated enough and civilized enough. So it is very sad to think that black people experience this, and not to pity them, because I don't know how much use that does, and I think you would agree with that, Jordan. It's not about pity, it's about making sure we try and understand that as white people, how they can face these complicated faces in society that we won't ever truly understand because we don't have to, fortunately, deal with this idea of social death. But it's such an interesting point that's been raised, and I've actually never heard of before of this, so I'm very fortunate to be educated this way and be educated by people that know this the best.
So there was this philosopher called Zinzendorf who discusses the idea that there is this natural hierarchy in society, and his idea was that black people are naturally at the bottom and that they're all destined to be slaves and that there's nothing else for them to do. And when you have a philosopher and a theologian discussing that sort of thing, and his works are important in the different denominations of Christianity, how do you counter that within the church hierarchy?
I don't know how to feel about that. I'm nowhere near as educated enough on that, and I want to be blatant and admit that. And I would hate to be in the position of how do you unpack that, because I would not know where to start. For someone who's had such an impact on Christianity, where do you start with that? Because it's not quite as simple as remove everything, and then that brings into wider debates of what do we do with Britain's colonial past, because you can link that so easily with the tearing down of statues recently and the removal of plaques and figureheads in all around the country, realistically. So that's a really interesting point you've just made, and it's definitely something that the Anglican Church should listen to and face. One point I would like to raise is that it was so important. I'm so glad they made sure that discussions today were entirely led by black people. I'm so glad that they took the centre stage, and as white people, we should be very grateful that black people have taken the time out of their day to educate us, because that's not their responsibility to educate us. I thought it'd been really interesting if we'd had another ethnic minority on the panel who, to try and put this as politically correct as possible, looked different, as in looked Asian, because obviously people from different races are treated differently. As we know, although Roger does have Asian descent and he's very proud of that and talks about it very openly, Roger does not look Asian. So it'd been so interesting to understand how Asian people who have a huge presence in our society, how they experience racism differently, and how they experience not only in our world but in the Anglican Church. I don't know if I can get your point of view on that, Jordan, but that would be very interesting to see the difference, as obviously black people are a minority, but they're not the only minority in Britain. So it's important to make sure we don't talk about just black people. It's about making sure that all our ethnic minorities are represented and talked about. So what's your opinion on this, Jordan?
I think it will be interesting because you not only get to see how they interact with the system at large, you also, if you have multiple ethnic minorities on stage, you get to see how their experiences are similar or different and how they interact with each other, and then how, say, an Asian man has had experiences with Africans in his area growing up, and what those experiences are, and if they're any different to experiences they've had with white people. And exploring that is very interesting, and it would have been interesting to just have even one more ethnic minority on stage.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad that the people who were speaking today were ethnic minorities. That should be praised. We both do think that, if possible, it'd been great to have more representation. This is what this is about, but it's baby steps, and maybe the next conference we'll get a great someone who has Asian descent, whether that's East Asian, South Asian. It'd be really good next step for the conference to discuss. I think to talk about one main last topic is everyone who was speaking today mentioned about, and Jordan's mentioned this earlier, about sort of microaggressions and blissful ignorance. As Jordan has talked about blissful ignorance before early in the podcast, I'll just talk about microaggressions. Microaggressions are essentially a form of racism, which isn't overt racism. It's not hard racism, as in spitting on ethnic minorities, shouting racial slurs at them. It's doing smaller things that make people from different backgrounds feel uncomfortable. It's asking to touch black women's hair. It's questioning why they're in places. It's small things that make them feel uncomfortable and that they're not welcome in places. And it is a form of racism. And we've talked so much about overt racism. I think it's important to recognise the small parts of racism that people don't get. Stuff like not trying to say an African name or an Asian name, not attempting to, or making a big fuss of, oh, I can't get this. And that's stuff that we need to recognise more as racism. How do you feel, Jordan? Have you got any opinions on this?
Yeah, I see what you mean. And I think if you probably went through enough of those, they would probably be annoying at the end of the day. And linking back to what Rogers said, he basically said that a lot of the racism he experienced, and he wasn't saying this is all of the experiences in the church, but what he had experienced, it seemed like, were these types of things where it was just people not really knowing any better, that they had the best of intentions, they just didn't really know any better. And I think that is quite important, that there are some people who just need a little, like, you know, this might not be correct, maybe don't do that, or it might not be a nice way to really treat someone.
Yeah, no, I get that. It's about, sometimes you don't see racism, so people don't try and make things better. I don't know if that's the right way of phrasing things. Sort of like, well, no one's being racist here. No one hates the ethnic minority in the corner. No one hates this person who's black, but we're not helping them because they're black. And actually, sometimes that's what it's about. As you look at statistics, both here and in America, because they talk a lot about racism in America, that there's so many interesting documentaries. If you get the chance listening to the 13th Amendment, it's a Netflix show, and it talks about how racism has affected stuff in America. But obviously, we're in Britain. They talk about the lasting impacts of being black in this country. It's about making sure that just because there isn't racism present, there isn't pure racism and hatred towards people, it's about recognising that ultimately, because they're an ethnic minority, they're in a worse position. It's how we treat women as well. We make sure that we go, how do we create a safe place for women? How do we make sure that women are empowered? It's about doing the same for black people as well, and other ethnic minorities, to make sure that they are thought of, and to go, actually, we're not saying they can't come, but are we encouraging them to come? Are we showing that this is a place for them to come? And that is the role of white people. And it's sort of some of the last thing I want to talk about is, what is the role of white people in general, and what can cathedrals and individuals do to help ethnic minorities flourish and grow? And I think this is a really interesting point of, we've been lucky enough today to be educated by black people about racism, and that is such a privilege, because they didn't have to come here and teach us, because it's not their responsibility to teach us about racism. And this is a lot that's been talked about through the Black Lives Matter movement. It's not the responsibility of black people to teach us about racism, like it's not the responsibility of women to teach people about misogyny and sexism, and it's not the role of gay people to tell us about homophobia or transphobia. It's not their role. So what do you think the role white people and the Anglican Church can be to help solve or lessen the ills of racial injustice?
Well, I would link it back to Azariah's story of Quasimodo, in that Quasimodo is not just representative of people that have experienced racial injustice and experienced racial injustice in the Anglican Church, because Quasimodo can basically be anyone. And I would say that, similar to what we said about the Anglican Church needs to have safe spaces in cathedrals for ideas to flourish that, they can do for children or they can do for the working class.
It's this idea like that sanctuary, isn't it?
Yeah.
They talk so much about sanctuary, and maybe that is an end goal for all of this, is to create sanctuary for poor people, sanctuary for the climate, and sanctuary for people of different minorities.
Yeah, that's it. The thing about it at the end of the day is just creating a sanctuary, and I think that's just not the end goal, but that's the most important thing to achieve from this conference.
Yeah, making sure that anyone can walk through the door from any background and know this is a safe space, and it's about how the Anglican Church can be that, and how people maybe from that can maybe find God, because when you feel comfortable and safe and looked after, and this links so back well to what we were talking about our first ever podcast about radical welcome. You can tell that Newcastle Cathedral has created a sanctuary, and it's something, well, probably we've talked about community before. Sanctuary is probably the second biggest theme of this conference. Although these community and sanctuary isn't directly talked about, it's so present, and you can feel that this is maybe one of the solutions, is to create community, to create sanctuary, thus fostering community.
Yeah.
How the Anglican Church do this, I don't know, and hopefully the workshops that took place this afternoon all across Newcastle, we were both very jealous I was very jealous that I couldn't go, because they were going to some great places in Newcastle, some really beautiful sites, and hopefully some photos will be uploaded of the beautiful venues they went to. But is there any last words you have told Jordan? I know you have one quote you'd like to end on.
Azariah used a quote from American activist Dorothy Day, where she said, "I only love God as much as I love the person that I love the least," because ultimately God is in everyone, and if you can't love the worst person who still has God within them, then you can't love God, because you have to love everyone.
And I think that says it all, and I think we should all try and sit with that and really think about what that means. But yeah, I think that's a beautiful note to end on. Don't forget to check out our other podcast episodes, which you can find on Spotify and YouTube. Remember to use the hashtag NCC2022 and to comment, engage with the podcast, and to create discussion and opinions. That's again what the conference is all about. We look forward to talking to you tomorrow about the last day of the conference and rounding up our general thoughts and feelings of the whole experience. Thank you for listening to us, and we look forward to talking to you tomorrow. Bye.
Bye.